The supposed letter that Pontius Pilate would have written to the Roman Emperor Tiberius about Jesus is an intriguing source that contains surprising details about the appearances of Jesus, aspects that, interestingly, are not addressed in the traditional Gospels. In this correspondence, Pilate accurately reports the various miracles performed by Jesus, from healing illnesses to exorcising demons, highlighting the extraordinary impact his actions had on the population of the time. Additionally, the letter details the meticulous trial process that culminated in the crucifixion of Jesus, providing insights into the deliberations and political pressures involved. Even more fascinatingly, Pilate mentions the resurrection of Jesus, an event that challenges historical and theological understanding, describing not only the event itself, but also offering a physical description of Jesus after his resurrection. But what exactly does this letter reveal? What specific information did Pilate share with Tiberius about the resurrection of what many consider the Son of God? And how did he describe the physical appearance of Jesus in this significant context? Pilate begins his correspondence by addressing Tiberius Caesar, the Emperor of Rome, with a respectful greeting. "Greetings, Your Majesty." He goes on to explain that recent events in his province have been so extraordinary that he considers it essential to report them in detail, firmly believing that such occurrences could significantly influence the fate of the entire empire in the future. Pilate expresses a feeling that the traditional gods seem to be abandoning the region, suggesting a possible imminent spiritual or religious change. He bitterly recalls the day he took command of Judea, succeeding Valerius, marking the beginning of a period filled with constant concerns and deep personal anguish. Upon arriving in Jerusalem, Pilate took possession of the Praetorium and organized a grand banquet, demonstrating his intention to consolidate his power and establish good relations with the local leaders. For this event, he invited a tetrarch from Galilee, as well as the high priest and his officials, expecting a display of respect and cooperation. However, at the appointed time, no one attended the banquet, which Pilate interpreted as an act of contempt both towards him and the authority of the Roman government. Days later, the high priest visited Pilate with a serious demeanor, secretly claiming that his religion forbade him from sitting at the table with Romans, although Pilate noticed the falseness in the high priest's expression. Despite accepting the excuse presented, it became evident to Pilate that both the high priest and his followers harbored a veiled animosity towards the Romans. In response, he advised the Romans to maintain constant vigilance over the high priests of that land, as there was no doubt that these religious leaders were willing to betray even their own families in exchange for power and wealth. Furthermore, Pilate describes the difficulties faced in controlling the conquered cities, with Jerusalem being the most challenging. The local population is extremely rebellious, and he lives in constant fear of a revolt that could destabilize Roman control. With a limited contingent of soldiers, only 1 centurion and 100 men under his command, Pilate expresses his concern over the lack of reinforcements. He reports that he requested help from the governor of Syria, but received the response that the governor scarcely had enough soldiers to defend his own province. This scarcity of troops hinders the defense of Roman conquests and threatens the expansion of imperial dominance, leading Pilate to fear that this could result in the fall of the Roman government in the region. To mitigate possible negative influences, Pilate decided to stay away from the city center, fearing that priests might incite the rebels or influence the local population against the Romans. However, he made a conscious effort to understand the mindset and actions of the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Among the numerous rumors circulating, one in particular caught his attention. There was talk of a young man in Galilee who was preaching a new doctrine in the name of a God who, according to him, had sent him. Initially, Pilate suspected that this young man might be inciting the people against Roman authority, but over time, he began to realize that his influence was not limited to a simple incitement to rebellion. He observed that Jesus of Nazareth, the young man in question, seemed more like an ally of the Romans than an adversary, which left him even more intrigued about the true intentions and impact of this emerging leader in the region. During one of my passages through the central square of Jerusalem, I came across a large crowd gathered around a young man who was leaning against a tree, speaking eloquently and persuasively. Observing the scene calmly and discerningly, I immediately recognized that it was Jesus, whose presence among the crowd never ceased to intrigue me due to his distinct posture and the way his listeners reacted to him. Despite my initial intention to interrupt any possible incitement to disorder with my mere presence, I chose to continue on my way, maintaining an observer's stance. However, to better understand Jesus' influence over the people, I instructed my secretary, Manio, to mingle with the crowd and listen attentively to the words spoken by that man. Manio, my faithful secretary, has an intriguing lineage, being the grandson of a former conspirator who awaited Catiline in Etruria many years ago. His loyalty and ability to handle delicate matters are unquestionable, and his proficiency in Hebrew ensures that his interpretations are faithful and accurate, thus earning my complete trust. After mingling with the crowd, Manio returned to the praetorium with a detailed report on what Jesus had said. He reported that Jesus spoke words of wisdom that, according to Manio, he had never encountered in the works of traditional philosophers. One of the reasons that led me to grant freedom to Jesus was the perception that he was not a troublemaker or a rebel, but someone who possessed a true understanding of the spiritual needs of the population. I offered him my protection, allowing him to act, speak, gather with people, choose his disciples, and teach freely without the direct interference of any of my orders. Perhaps Jesus did not fully realize that this granted freedom provided him with significant space to influence the minds and hearts of those who followed him. However, the situation was far from ideal. I am constantly haunted by the possibility that the religion of our ancestors is gradually being replaced by Jesus' doctrines, which could lead to the fall of the Roman Empire. This tolerance, which initially seemed a prudent measure, now appears to be a catalyst for profound and possibly destructive changes. The freedom granted to Jesus disturbed the wealthiest and most influential Jews who saw their traditions and power being challenged. In his interactions, Jesus was relentless in confronting these leaders, declaring to them, "You are like serpents. They appear to be painted tombs on the outside, but inside they are full of death." Moreover, he openly criticized local traditions, emphasizing that humility was more valuable in the eyes of God than any social status or material wealth these leaders possessed. These statements not only enraged the powerful, but also fueled resistance against my administration, placing me in an increasingly precarious position. Daily, I received numerous complaints at the praetorium about the audacity of Jesus and the potential threat he posed to the stability of Jerusalem. There were constant rumors that something catastrophic could happen, reminding me of the historical tendency to stone those considered prophets. A summons to Caesar was being prepared, and the Senate had approved the request for reinforcements only after the conclusion of the Persian War, as the available troops were insufficient to contain a possible revolt. Faced with this imminent crisis, I decided to take a decisive measure to restore peace in the city. Without the need to expose myself directly, I wrote a letter to Jesus, inviting him for a conversation at the praetorium. Jesus accepted the invitation and came to me. Being of Spanish and Roman blood, he did not easily show fear or enthusiasm. However, when Jesus appeared, I felt a strange sensation of immobility, as if my feet were nailed to the ground. The marble of the praetorium seemed to tremble beneath my feet, reflecting an inexplicable guilt, while the Nazarene remained serene, emanating a tranquility that exuded innocence. He approached, stopped, and with a subtle gesture seemed to communicate that his presence there was sufficient, without the need for additional words. For a moment, I was surprised and deeply impressed by the figure of Jesus, a man who, in a way, defied the artistic and social conventions of the time. I never imagined that while sculpting figures for gods and heroes, I could find someone whose presence was so repulsive, yet, paradoxically, so attractive. I felt old and fragile, unable to resist the force of his presence, which led me to approach closer than usual. "Jesus," I finally said with a hesitant voice, "Jesus of Nazareth, in the last 3 years, I have granted you total freedom of expression and do not regret this decision. Your words are practical and wise. I recognize that you must have read Socrates or Plato, but the simplicity and majesty of your discourse elevate you far beyond these philosophers. The Emperor is aware of this, and as his representative here, I am pleased to have allowed this freedom that we so desperately need. Inform him that his words have attracted powerful and easily deceived enemies," I continued, "just as Socrates also had his enemies and ultimately fell victim to them. His enemies are even more enraged by his harsh words and with me for allowing him to speak freely. Some even accuse me of conspiring with you to weaken the little civil power that Rome still grants the Hebrews. My recommendation, and not an order, is that you be more careful and moderate in your speeches from now on, considering that your enemies may exploit pride to incite the more ignorant people against you and force me to act according to the law." Jesus responded calmly and resolutely, "Ruler of the land, your words do not reflect true wisdom. Ask Mount Tabor to stop in the middle of the valley, and he will say that he obeys the laws of nature and God, the Creator. Only he knows where the waters flow. I speak the truth. Before the rose of Sharon blooms, only blood will be shed. Your blood will not be shed." I responded to Jesus with an enthusiasm I could barely contain. "You are more valuable for your wisdom than all those rebellious Pharisees who abuse the freedom the Romans allow them. These men admit to conspiring against Caesar and spread lies, making the people believe that he is a tyrant who wishes their destruction. They are ungrateful and blind to the fact that, often, the wolf disguises itself in sheep's clothing to fulfill its nefarious purposes. I will protect you, Nazarene. My praetorium will be a sacred refuge for you, a safe shelter day and night." However, Jesus, in his unwavering serenity, merely shook his head and smiled slightly, as if seeing beyond the words. With the same tranquility, he replied, "When the time comes, there will be no refuge for the Son of Man, neither on earth nor beneath it. The true refuge is in the heavens, as the prophets have pointed out. What was written will be fulfilled, and today's unrest will be tomorrow's peace." Faced with the firmness of his words, I retorted, "Your ideas are forcing me to consider a conversion. However, my position compels me to turn this request into an order. For the safety of this province, under my responsibility, you must moderate your speeches. Do not disobey me. May happiness accompany you to God." Jesus, however, remained impassive. He looked at me with a serene expression and with his voice full of conviction replied, "I did not come into the world to bring unrest, but peace, love, and charity. I was born on the same day that Augustus Caesar brought peace to the Roman Empire. The persecutions do not come from me, but I accept them, coming from others, in obedience to the will of the Father who showed me the way. Control your worries, Governor, for it is not within your power to stop the sacrifice of a victim on the altar." With that, he walked away, his figure slowly disappearing like a luminous shadow behind the curtains of the horizon. I felt a great relief, as if an immense weight had been lifted from me. The presence of Jesus was something that even Herod, with all his cunning and power, could not bear. Herod, already aged and resentful, had joined Jesus' enemies to execute his revenge. If it were up to Herod alone, he would have ordered the death of Jesus immediately. However, despite his pride and royal position, he hesitated to take any action that could harm his influence before the Senate. Perhaps, like me, Herod also feared Jesus, though he would never admit such a feeling in public. Herod once came to visit me at the Praetorium. After a superficial and unimportant conversation, he stood to leave and, in an unassuming tone, asked me what I thought of the Nazarene. I replied that he seemed to be one of the great philosophers who occasionally emerge in prominent nations. His teachings, I continued, had no political implications that threatened Rome, which was why we had decided to allow him to speak freely. Herod merely smiled sarcastically, bowing in an ironic reverence before taking his leave. The great Jewish festival was approaching, and I knew that tensions in the city would only increase. With the arrival of Passover, popular fervor took over Jerusalem. The city was overcrowded, and rumors about Jesus reached a new peak. My informants reported that the religious leaders had used the temple treasury to bribe the people and instigate them against the Nazarene. The crowd was immense, and agitation seemed inevitable. I requested reinforcements from the Syrian procurator, 100 infantry soldiers and 100 cavalrymen, but he refused, claiming that his own troops were committed. Isolated with a small group of veterans in a hostile city, I was forced to tolerate the incessant shouts echoing through the streets. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Three major factions, the Herodians, Sadducees, and Pharisees, had united against Jesus. Although their motivations were ambiguous, they all shared a deep hatred for the Nazarene. The Herodians and Sadducees were tired of Roman domination and despised Jesus' criticisms, who had exposed their hypocrisies for years. The Pharisees saw Jesus as an enemy of their traditions and a threatening spiritual opponent. Meanwhile, I still faced the unstable and revolt-prone population who took advantage of any disorder to cause chaos. The situation reached a critical point when Jesus was brought before the high priest Caiaphas and condemned to death. With a false submission, Caiaphas sent Jesus to me to confirm the condemnation and ensure his execution. However, I declared that being from Galilee, Jesus should be judged by Herod. I sent him there, but Herod, demonstrating the same artificial deference, returned Jesus, shifting the responsibility back to me. My palace turned into a fortress, surrounded by dissatisfied people whose numbers were increasing by the moment. The city was filled with crowds descending from the mountains of Nazareth, and it seemed that all of Judea was converging on Jerusalem. Amidst this chaos, a Gaulish seer presented himself at the Praetorium. Throwing himself at my feet, he begged and cried out, warning me in a terrified tone, "Be careful, this man is sacred." I saw him in visions walking on water and flying on the wings of the wind. I saw the river on Mount Catherine run with blood, the statues of Caesar shed tears, and the morning sun appear like a mourning virgin. If you ignore this warning, a great evil will fall upon you and Rome. His words left me uneasy, but there was no room for hesitation. The crowd's shouts demanding Jesus' death were shaking the walls of the Praetorium. Upon bringing him back to the tribunal, I asked the crowd what Jesus' crime was. They responded that he had blasphemed, prophesied the destruction of the temple, and declared himself the Son of God. I tried to argue, explaining that Roman justice did not condemn anyone to death for such accusations, but the shouts of crucify him," were deafening. Despite my attempts to protect Jesus, the pressure was unbearable. I proposed to release him as part of the Passover tradition of releasing a prisoner, but the people insisted on his crucifixion. I argued again, pointing out that according to Jewish laws, no prisoner could be condemned without the consent of the Sanhedrin and a full day's fasting by the judges. However, the crowd was unyielding. I determined that the sentence be carried out the next day, but not without first requiring the Sanhedrin to review the entire judicial process and their own legislations. I insisted on a series of formalities that should be followed, still hoping that this would bring some rationality to that enraged mob. I ordered that a man remain at the court gate holding a banner, while another, mounted on a horse, should announce the condemned man's name, the crime committed, and the names of the witnesses, loudly asking if anyone could present evidence of his innocence. Even on the way to the execution, the prisoner had the right to return up to 3 times to present new arguments or evidence in his defense. However, despite all these measures, the shouts of crucify him," continued, growing louder and more intense. In an attempt to appease the crowd, I ordered that Jesus be scourged, believing that this might be enough to satisfy the growing hatred. But instead of diminishing the mob's fury, the punishment only fueled their hatred further. Then, in a public gesture, I asked for a basin and washed my hands before that furious mass. I declared as clearly as possible that in my judgment, Jesus of Nazareth had not committed any crime deserving the death penalty. "I am innocent of this man's blood," I declared. However, my words were ignored. The decision seemed to have been sealed even before the trial. It was as if forces beyond my understanding were directing those events toward an inevitable conclusion. I had witnessed civil unrest before, but never anything like that day in Jerusalem. The crowd seemed driven by a dark force, as if all the spirits from the depths of hell had descended upon the city. The agitated mass moved in furious waves from the gates of the Praetorium to Mount Zion, in a whirlwind of shouts and chaos that surpassed any other agitation I had witnessed, whether in Pannonia or the Forum. As the day progressed, the sky began to darken. It was a twilight reminiscent of the Ides of March, when Julius Caesar met his end. As the ruler of such a turbulent province, I retreated to a corner of the basilica, from where I observed the grim scene. The innocent Nazarene was being led to his execution, and the city around me seemed a desolate emptiness. The air carried an oppressive sadness, as if all of Jerusalem was silently mourning. The atmosphere was imbued with a heavy premonition, and something in my heart told me that what was happening was not just a human drama, but something of divine dimensions. Sounds of agony echoed from Golgotha, carried by the wind like supernatural laments, and dark clouds began to gather around the temple, spreading like a dark veil over the city. It was a terrifying spectacle, both in the skies and on the earth. Many Jews, superstitious, were terrified when an earthquake shook Egypt and its surroundings. Some believed it was a sign of divine wrath. Amidst this chaotic scenario, news arrived that Balthasar, a Jewish scholar from Antioch and a close friend of Jesus, had been found dead. No one knew for sure whether his death was caused by fear or deep sorrow. That night, cloaked in my cape, I descended into the city towards Golgotha. The sacrifice had been consummated. The crowd, now dispersed, was returning to their homes with an air of repentance and sorrow. Despite the day's chaos, the prevailing silence was almost more disturbing than the shouts that had echoed hours earlier. Some Roman soldiers remained silent, their insignias laden with mourning. I heard murmurs among the Jews, many talking about signs and miracles they associated with Jesus. Others still looked to Calvary Mount as if expecting something more to happen. Upon returning to the Praetorium, I ascended the stairs, still stained with the blood of the Nazarene. It was then that I noticed an old man kneeling in supplication, surrounded by Romans who were visibly moved. The man, amidst tears, threw himself at my feet, and I saw in his face a pain so genuine that I could not contain my own emotion. "Who are you and what do you want?" I asked. "I am Joseph of Arimathea," he replied with a choked voice. "I come to request permission to bury Jesus of Nazareth." I consented to his request, and a soldier accompanied Joseph and other followers of Jesus to ensure that the body was treated with respect and that the tomb was not desecrated. A few days later, news arrived that would shake Jerusalem even more. The tomb was empty. The disciples began to proclaim that Jesus had resurrected just as he had predicted. This revelation caused even greater commotion than his death. I investigated the occurrence, but could not find definitive answers. It is alleged that Herod and Joseph used the tomb as part of some plan, but whether they were aware of or involved with the resurrection remains a mystery. The day after the burial, a priest came to the praetorium warning that the disciples might try to steal Jesus' body to simulate the resurrection. To prevent this, I sent a contingent led by Captain Mark to guard the tomb. However, when news of the empty tomb arrived, my concern intensified. I sought out Mark, who reported the occurrence with precision. He had assigned his lieutenant Benam with a century to guard the site, but the soldiers, terrified by the strange events of that night, were in shock. Tomorrow I will call Isam, who was present, to report everything he witnessed. Isam, the lieutenant responsible for the guards, reported the strange occurrences of that night with a mixture of perplexity and fear. He explained that shortly before the start of the fourth watch, a soft and beautiful light appeared over Jesus' tomb. At first, he thought it might be a group of women coming to embalm the body, as was customary, but he couldn't understand how they had passed by the guards without anyone noticing. While still reflecting on this, the light intensified and illuminated the entire area. It was then that he witnessed something even more extraordinary. What seemed to be a crowd of figures, wrapped in shrouds, emerging in a state of renewed youth and joy. A celestial melody echoed in the air, a music so sublime that he said he had never heard anything comparable. The sound of the voices was like a choir praising God, filling the environment with a divine atmosphere. Isam recounted that suddenly the earth began to tremble violently, an earthquake so intense that he felt incapable of standing. His strength abandoned him, and he fell to the ground, unable to fully comprehend what was happening. The last thing he remembered before losing consciousness was the bright light and the figures dancing like divine shadows around the tomb. Upon regaining consciousness, Isam reported that he was lying on his stomach, still feeling his body weak and shaken. I asked if he could have been confused, thinking that the light was dawn. He responded that he initially considered this hypothesis, but quickly realized that it was still night and that the sky remained dark. I questioned whether the episode could have been caused by exhaustion or dizziness from standing up too quickly, but he vehemently denied it. He explained that, being strict, he had not slept during his watch, as he knew that the punishment for sleeping on duty was severe. However, he admitted that he had allowed some soldiers to rest during that period and that many of them were asleep during the events. I insisted on knowing how long the scene had lasted. He stated that he couldn't say for certain, but I calculated based on his descriptions that it lasted approximately an hour until the light began to dissipate and daybreak started. I asked if he had approached the tomb after the event, but Isam confessed that he was very afraid and that as soon as reinforcements arrived, he and the other guards immediately returned to the barracks. When I asked about the priest's reaction, he revealed that they were deeply concerned about the impact of what had occurred. Isam recounted that the priests tried to convince the guards to claim that there had been an earthquake and that during the confusion, the disciples had stolen Jesus' body. They offered money in exchange for this account, but Isam refused. He explained that he had not seen disciples or any signs of theft, and that he only learned of the body's disappearance when the priests themselves informed him of it. He also mentioned that some priests were visibly shaken, discussing among themselves the possibility that Jesus was not an ordinary man. Some suggested that he could be a supernatural figure, something that had been present on earth before, in the times of Abraham, Lot, and other significant moments in history. These reports began to convince me that Jesus of Nazareth was indeed an extraordinary figure. His impact was not limited to his followers. Both friends and enemies recognized his ability to perform impressive feats, turning water into wine, healing diseases, bringing the dead to life, calming storms, and even finding coins in fish mouths. These actions, witnessed by many, aroused great enmity among the religious leaders of Judea. However, he was never accused of actual crimes, nor of hurting anyone or breaking laws. His acts were known by thousands of people, and his words reverberated like incontestable truths. When Isam finished recounting the events, I remained silent, reflecting on everything I had heard. In my heart echoed the phrase of one of the soldiers who had been present at the crucifixion: "Truly, this was the Son of God." This declaration seemed to summarize everything I had witnessed since I knew the Nazarene. It was not just his physical presence that impressed, but his essence, his unwavering calm, his genuine compassion, and the serenity with which he faced the crowds. His tranquil posture, even in the face of hatred and violence, made him a unique and incomparable figure. Pontius Pilate, in his words, described Jesus as a man of medium stature, whose presence was marked by uncommon serenity and kindness. His demeanor conveyed peace and compassion, deeply touching everyone around him. Even in his most difficult moments, Jesus seemed to look at people with profound understanding, as if he saw beyond their actions and perceived their souls. It was impossible not to be impressed by him, as his mere presence seemed to illuminate even the darkest places. The written accounts about Jesus describe his appearance with striking details, highlighting features that made him a unique and unmistakable figure. His hair was long, softly falling over his shoulders in a harmonious flow, described as slightly wavy and in a shade that varied between light brown and blonde. This unusual coloration for the region made him stand out among the crowds. But it was not just his hair that caught attention. His deeply penetrating eyes were often described with colors that varied according to the observer's perception. Some mentioned a light brown tone, while others claimed they were bluish. What everyone agreed on, however, was that these eyes conveyed incomparable wisdom, an engaging kindness, and a serene firmness that seemed to unveil the secrets of the human heart. Jesus' skin was described as fair, with a healthy and smooth appearance, similar to someone who works outdoors but still maintains a well-kept look. His face, considered beautiful and perfectly symmetrical, conveyed confidence and inspired reverence in all who beheld him. It was not just about pleasing physical traits, but about an expression of natural authority that was neither imposing nor threatening. His beard, full and well-groomed, gave him a mature and respectable appearance, adding a sense of dignity to his presence. Always dressed simply, Jesus exhibited a dignity that transcended the material. His clothes were clean yet modest, usually consisting of a tunic and a long cloak. He did not wear flashy accessories or jewelry, clearly demonstrating his detachment from wealth and material things. His appearance reflected his message of humility and simplicity. Even in his imposing presence, he was someone who, with just a look or a gesture, conveyed an inner peace and a sense of well-being that seemed to deeply touch the soul of those who encountered him. Noble sovereign, this is the most faithful account I can present regarding the events related to Jesus of Nazareth. I took care to narrate everything with the utmost precision, so that your Majesty can justly evaluate my behavior and the decisions I made concerning this case. I know that many criticisms have been directed against me in this matter, but even so, I deemed it necessary to report all the details so that the truth may prevail. With promises of loyalty and respect, I remain as the most obedient of your servants. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel now and click on the video button that appears on the screen to discover more mysteries like this one.